This roundtable brings together practitioners from Antarctic governance, institutional innovation, and long-term stewardship to explore the concept of preemptive peace. Environmental peace building has traditionally centered on conflict-affected and post-conflict settings. This roundtable makes the case for another approach, establishing governance architectures that preserve civilisational optionality by acting before a crisis rather than after. Antarctica presents a uniquely powerful case for preemptive peace due to intersecting geopolitical, ecological, and governance factors. The panelists today will examine the political, regenerative, and institutional architectures needed to support effective multi-agent coordination at regional to planetary scales, with Antarctica as a proving ground for building effective relationships around shared spaces. We will further hear how environmental peace building can contribute to and learn from this emerging field. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our incredible speakers. First, Andrew Kelly is a strategic advisor and independent practitioner working on Antarctica as a test case for governing shared planetary systems before crisis narrows the field of action. He's the former CEO of the Antarctic Science Foundation, where he worked across Australian and international Antarctic science, philanthropy, and policy networks, engaging with over 300 research scientists. His current work focuses on Antarctic governance and planetary commons, asking how legitimacy, coordination, and restraint can be built before environmental stress and geopolitical competition harden into reactive conflict. Andrew will also be speaking in person at the conference on the 19th. Next, among other roles, Indy Johar leads the development of the Civilisation Options Fund as a co-founder of Dark Matter Labs. His work focuses on the institutional, legal, and financial dark matter that shapes societies and on designing organizational forms capable of holding trade-offs, building legitimate multi-agent coordination, and converting diffuse need into durable commitment under conditions of volatility. Finally, Stephen Heintz is president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, where he leads the foundation's long-term commitment to democratic practice, peace building, and sustainable development. He brings decades of work at the intersection of philanthropy, multilateral governance, and institutional stewardship. His perspective on the crisis of multilateralism bridges institutional innovation and the practical governance of the global commons. With that, I would like to turn to some brief remarks from each of the panelists in a discussion format. And I'll begin with Andrew to set the scene with the Antarctic Treaty System and Antarctica as a working test case for preemptive peace. Andrew, you bring direct experience from your work across Antarctic science, policy, and the Antarctic Treaty System. Can you tell us, please, why should the public care about the fate of Antarctica?
Thank you, Linda. The public should care about the fate of Antarctica because Antarctica is not remote, not in any meaningful sense, whether it be through connection, nature, or systems. Antarctica is upstream of almost everything, yet politically downstream of almost nothing. Most people see a sliver of white at the bottom of our Mercator maps and atlases, but this land, this continent, is 1.5 times the size of Canada. So whilst most imagine it to be a distant white wilderness, beautiful, fragile, and symbolic, but usually very separate to their lives, and this is the wrong mental model I maintain. We need to think of Antarctica more as humanity's family refrigerator and our planetary pool pump. Antarctica has received heat from the planet and space and returned cool air and atmosphere and water to the oceans for millions of years. The circumpolar current around Antarctica is the most powerful on the planet, and it drives all of our oceans and rich nutrients from Antarctica into the fisheries and the wider water systems of the Earth. Now, when the refrigerator or the pool pump starts to fail, it's a rare household that debates whether or not these items warrant repair. So Antarctica's household infrastructure, if you like, but at a planetary scale. Now, the scientists that I work with say that what happens in Antarctica doesn't stay in Antarctica. So we need to see Antarctica as a complex system which regulates and influences other complex systems. This then builds cascading risks which live inside orders of consequence. So destabilization in Antarctica carries significant risks to sea level rises, ocean circulation, weather systems, and fisheries, which then issue into food systems, coastal risks, migration pressures, and geopolitical stability. So Antarctica is not merely a place where we should protect because it's beautiful, although it is. It's a hyper object within our natural home, and it supports life and makes human flourishing, our food security, and our economic possibilities continuous. So the issue is not simply melting ice, the issue is cascading instability in this complex system and the interconnection of it with other systems. The public should care because Antarctica is not over there. It's one of the systems that actually keeps over here livable. And we should also disavow ourselves that Antarctica or the Earth needs saving. Both will continue in some form. The planet will be just fine without us. She's dealt with mass extinction events a few times before, though this is the first time that the tenants are in danger of losing their bond. So the question really is whether the systems on which human societies depend upon remain stable enough for us. And so the problem's not that Antarctica belongs to nobody. The problem, as we'll discuss today, is more that Antarctica affects everybody, but almost nobody feels politically responsible for it. And so that's why I maintain that Antarctica is important and that people should care about it.
Thank you. And you raise a good point about not feeling politically responsible for a lot of reasons. Can you, and this is related to the next question, can you share with us some of the core Antarctic governance challenges and why they're occurring? And what do these governance design challenges say about the potential impacts that the rest of the world faces from a declining Antarctica, some of which you've touched on already?
Thank you. Yes, so the Antarctic Treaty System is one of humanity's great achievements. And to see what was produced in 1959, where 12 countries came together at a complex turning point in the Cold War. So that was Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand and Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. All came together and showed tremendous foresight by signing the Antarctic Treaty. And what they did was some very key things. It's a simple document, but they froze territorial claims. They demilitarized Antarctica, so there's been no armed conflict in Antarctica. It's the only continent on Earth to have that moniker. And then they preserved the continent for science, cooperation, and for peace. Now, the ATS today is being asked to handle pressures it was never designed to carry. So, to your point, what are the main challenges? Firstly, it was designed for a different era. So the assumptions that sit underneath not only the document, but the psychology of the Antarctic Treaty System was that there would be shared diplomatic good faith, that there would be strategic restraint between countries. There was a relatively low public attention in Antarctica. They had a stable environment and no or low climate disruption or pressure. Science at the time was a sufficient basis for cooperation on the continent, and there was limited commercial activity. And all of the rivalries in 1959 at the geopolitical level were relatively slow moving. Today, we are now in an era of climate destabilization, geopolitical competition, and the temptation of the resources that are in Antarctica, massive tourism growth, krill fishing and ecosystem pressure, where marine protected areas have been on hold in Antarctica for quite some time, possible hydrocarbon interest, drilling for oil and gas, security anxiety everywhere, consensus paralysis within the community of the treaty, and global consequences that exist beyond that treaty community. So the second challenge is that consensus now functions as a veto. Consensus was once the great achievement of the Antarctic Treaty, where it preserved peace and cooperation, but now a country abstaining from a vote can effectively veto any new movement in the domains that the treaty meet on annually. So the system is still functioning procedurally, while substantively many critical issues remain stalled indefinitely. Now, for years we were reassured that this is the system working as it was designed, and as soon as pressures abated, the consensus system would progress some significant issues and proposals in Antarctica. But this has become the language of nothing being done. The third challenge is that the system assumes good faith. And so the treaty system emerged in a world that assumed that good faith and shared restraint, but that's not the world we have today. And then the fourth challenge is now that Antarctica affects everyone. The world has got significantly smaller. So the consequences of Antarctic destabilisation now reach coastal cities and insurers, fisheries, ports and food systems. We've got security communities and indigenous peoples who are affected, middle powers and civil society. And the governance imagination just can't remain confined to a small diplomatic group. So what that now means is that we need to widen the legitimacy, the constituency and the transparency and expand the political imagination around this treaty. At this point in time in human trajectory, having conversations like the one we're having right now is really crucial and much appreciated, because this widens Antarctic governance, legitimacy and transparency. And so ultimately, Antarctica doesn't suffer from a lack of science. It increasingly suffers from a lack of political and moral imagination that's adequate to the amazing science that's being done down south.
Well, thank you for your expertise on Antarctica and sort of setting the baseline for having this discussion today. As I turn next to Indy, I got to highlight a couple of things you said with regard to the cascading instability that we may be facing with Antarctica, and the increasing pressures that we're feeling from a number of different areas around Antarctica today that didn't exist when the Antarctic Treaty System was enacted back in the late 50s. So, Indy, I'd like to turn to you to raise, in this context, governance and civilizational questions, and also, as Andrew touched on, security framing issues. The grave challenges that we face from the degradation of Antarctica are prompting new examinations of institutional forms that can hold such challenges, this imagination that Andrew was just talking about. You've spoken about civilisational optioneering, which values system adaptation and optimizes for long-term viability. Can you tell us more about civilizational optioneering and how it might preemptively create the long-term conditions we need for peace generally?
Yeah, thank you, Linda, and thank you, Andrew, for setting that up. So I think just building also on what Andrew said, I think there's several things in play. I think on one dimension, we're living in a world where the issue is no longer about the conservation of the Antarctic. So what I understand from the science, the problem is that we've already pumped enough CO2 into the air that we're going to be operating in a different worldview. Certainly with regards to the Arctic, that's the case. Right now, we are in an act that basically conservation, we cannot just leave it alone and it will solve itself. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem now, because all of our treaty structures are designed around preservation, conservation, and we are now operating in a different climatic environment at a structural level. Then I think when you compose with that the problem, which is that I think states are operating in a sense of existential risk to self. States are no longer operating in the last 40 years or 70 years of the rule-based order. They're operating with an idea that there is an existential risk to self, and that idea can be manifested through whether it's accessing AGI and the energy required to access AGI, and if a state doesn't get that, they will be basically no longer able to be free, or whether the provision of protein and access to protein. So when you put these sorts of existential theses together at the level of state, I think it's changing the nature of our political boundary in the negotiation space, which I think, again, is what Andrew was saying. So I think, the rules-based order is long dead, because I think that crisis of where states perceive themselves, and thereby their landscape of diplomacy is changing. And I think when you put that in the context uh, of actually what this then requires is that this opens up, I think, the last 10, 15 years, we've had many calls of planetary governance, global governance, innovation demands. And I think one of the kind of most interesting things is the Antarctica and planetary hyperobjects are probably going to be the sites of this new governance future. And if we can't make those governance futures, it's also super clear that we pretty much self-terminate. If you look at the cascading risk points that these environments put up. So these are existential to the idea of us as a civilization across the planet. And I think our ability to resolve them is critical. And why that I think that's important is it kind of reminds me, or certainly rhymes, and I don't think we repeat history, but we certainly rhyme with history. It rhymes with the River Danube in a way, as a classic example for me, which is that our ability to construct international waters after the wars around the River Danube set the precedents for the League of Nations and also the UN system coming out of that. So I think what we're looking at is the site of the Antarctica as a site of discovering next forms of planetary governance. And I think that will require us to understand Antarctica as a systems problem, not a boundary problem. And I think that requires us to build a new theory of politics, again, is what Andrew was rightly saying, in terms of our interdependency, whether it's at the protein level, whether it's the climate level, whether it's sea level level, all of these things require a new form of political boundary and construction of a new politics, which builds awareness of how dependent we are around the world with this piece of planetary infrastructure, and our capacity to build new types of institutionware, which I think will be, if you would ask me to go radical, I would say it will almost certainly be some form of, I would anticipate, an Antarctica Development Bank will almost certainly be the case, probably supported in different ways by multiple nations coming together to be able to actually capitalize the kind of the stabilization and the protein infrastructure and the rejuvenation of the Antarctica in a really different way. And it will need to be constituted in a new format with probably maybe even borrowing stuff from the IMF in terms of sovereign drawing rights and other things to be able to construct and capitalize these new types of institutions. So I suppose what I want to amplify is that what Andrew was saying, I think, is understanding the Antarctica in a fundamentally different problem space to where it was and where the Antarctic Treaty was conceived. And it will require a new type of institutional landscape. And if we could do that, I think we also open up a really critical pathway of actually addressing planetary governance in a fundamentally different way. And those three things are really important. And I think moving away from the kind of conservation theory, I think given that it's not available anymore. And I think our ability to build, whether it's sites like the Antarctica or sites like Arctic or even locations in Amazon and Congo, which are key planetary pieces of infrastructure, our ability to hold and govern them is almost fundamental to human civilization survival. And I think that is the site of deep exploration that's critical right now. What I do find is that the appetite, because these are existential questions, is also changing. We're moving away from project-based thinking to imagining these as kind of international space station type programs. So it's almost like, how do you build a new type of international space station type program around the Antarctica and Arctic and other critical infrastructures, which I think opens up the pathway for planetary governance in new ways. But yeah, so just building that together, I think that's what the demand is, that's what the opportunity is. And I think if we don't do it, I think we're really, according to certainly the science as I understand it, we're in a really terrible place. And that confluence forces us to open up a whole new landscape, which I'm really grateful for these conversations are doing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Indy. Oh, and if you could say, we've got another couple of minutes for your introductory provocation. If you could say a couple more words about how Antarctica could serve as a global model for this concept of preemptive peace through civilizational optioneering or through related approaches. You mentioned the River Danube, for example. How could the work that we're talking about today around Antarctica have us think about the political imagination that we need in order to move forward in this new geopolitical and ecological and technological landscape that we find ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, so several things on that. I think what we're massively underpricing, in my view, is the pathway to break down basically large scale conflict, internal and external conflict. What the Antarctica is driving and the collapse of the Antarctica is driving, whether it's protein or whether it's kind of basically sea level rises, this will effectively drive a form of expansion of conflict around the world that I think we're massively undervaluing and under considering. Two, I think what is really important is to see that the cost of war has declined to such a small level that actually this will allow for a kind of this will set us on a path which I personally don't believe we can actually recover from. This is not a recoverable, reversible situation if we walk down this violence landscape. So I think when you see the tipping point capacities of conflict, I think looking at foundational goods and starting to be able to build biophysical continuity and biophysical stability of critical goods is an existential issue, as opposed to it being a sort of nice to have issue because our fundamentals are so weak. So I think, so, I would envisage in the next 20 years, 10 to 20 years, the great powers, whoever they may be, will almost certainly build a new form of biophysical security alliance and an institution for funding that stability because it will be in their interest. This is a non-divisible problem. And I think this is what I think we're starting to recognize the system level couplings that we're starting to see is this requires a non-divisible, these are non-divisible problems where nobody can isolate themselves. And I think being able to, so from our perspective, our ability to operationalize these sorts of imaginations, these sorts of negotiations, this sort of diplomacy, this sort of new institutional hardware is critical not just for this, but for many of the challenges that we're seeing around the world, whether it's ocean infrastructure, which we're looking at, all the way to atmospheric river governance, all the way, and these are all opening up, or even whales, like we're in conversations like how do you build a transnational whales nation, a kind of a species-oriented whale nation, and you're seeing these sorts of conversations open up. So for me, this is a signature capability, and because it's non-territorially, no humans really live there, apart from scientists, which obviously are human, but there's no real long-term habitation of it. It opens up a unique pathway to starting to think about this. I do think it'll take time, but I think it's one of the critical pathways to stabilizing some of these risks that we're facing, and certainly the cascading risks that we're facing around that pathway. So, from an expanding civilization optionality level, we see it as a critical asset that needs to be explored and will be deployed, will be replicated in different institutions around the world as well.
Thank you. Some of the things that you're saying dovetail nicely with the invitation to Stephen to pull these provocations together and offer some next steps, especially some of the concepts around the non-divisibility and existential nature of some of the challenges that we're facing. So I'd like to turn to Stephen to do that. And noting that, Stephen, you authored the seminal 2024 report, A Logic for the Future, International Relations in the Age of Turbulence, which recommends holistic reforms of global governance institutions to respond to urgent transnational challenges. Stephen, can you share one or more of the recommendations in your report that you believe particularly apply to developing next steps for Antarctic governance?
Thank you very much, Linda. It's really a pleasure to be part of this discussion. I had the privilege of visiting Antarctica in March of 2018, and as part of a climate investigation. And you can't visit that spectacular place and not experience at the same time both the beauty and the peril of our planet. I think it's the equivalent of being in outer space and looking back at the images of our planet that have been so inspiring to astronauts and to those of us who've been able to view their photography. Antarctica is a very similar otherworldly experience that demonstrates so profoundly the challenges ahead for this planet and for human life and other life on this planet. So, as I was thinking about the fact that our world has entered into an age of, in some ways, unprecedented turbulence with more violent conflict than at any time in the last 3 or 4 decades. There's a new report that just was issued yesterday from the University of Uppsala in Sweden documenting unprecedented levels of violence and the loss of human life through conflict. We also have an accelerating climate crisis, which is really reaching tipping points at a much faster pace than we had anticipated. And all of the knock-on effects of that, the mass movement of people around the world, the displacement of people from their homes, the loss of livelihoods, and all of those things which exacerbate conflict. We have three existential crises happening simultaneously: a new nuclear arms race, the climate crisis, and the threats from hyper-disruptive technologies like AI and biomedical technology, which have the potential to do great good for humankind and the planet, but also have inherent peril of very profound nature. So we're in a period of unprecedented turbulence. And as I was doing my work to think about the future, I was reminded of work that Peter Drucker had done in the 1980s, the management theorist. And he wrote, "The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself, it's acting with yesterday's logic." And indeed, I think that's what this challenges. And I think Antarctica is a perfect case in point. We are facing this world of profound turbulence, of profound risk, and yet we are acting with logic that is anachronistic. It's no longer fit for the challenges we face. And the institutions that we have built over the centuries, and in particular in the post-World War II period, are based on a logic that is no longer applicable to these challenges. And so we need an entirely new logic, and that will help us then, define and create the new institutional framework that both Andrew and Indy have been talking about. And let me just give you a few examples of the logic, elements of the logic of the past, and how we might think about a logic for the future. So one that is clearly related to the challenges of Antarctica is anthropocentrism. This is a major element of the logic that has driven international relations and human relations for a very, very long time. And we now know that we are interdependent with all the rest of life on this planet. And unless we begin to think about the entire community of life and think of ourselves as a part of that entire community and not distinct from it, we are going to continue to perpetuate activities that are going to only exacerbate the threats. Another logic of the past that is no longer relevant is the focus on national sovereignty, the kind of emphasis on national sovereignty. And we need to now be moving toward a logic that looks at shared sovereignty and collective sovereignty and human sovereignty. And Antarctica is an interesting case in point here as well, because one of the great innovations of the Treaty of 1959 was, in essence, as Andrew said, to put away sovereign claims, sovereign disputes, and to organize a governance model for Antarctica that in essence was a shared sovereignty model. We see other examples of this in the European Union or the African Union, and these are also encouraging. A third logic of the past is the primacy of national interest. And in the logic of the future, we must have a focus on the global commons. And Antarctica, for the reasons Andrew and Indy have already said, is an element of the global commons, a critical element of the global commons. And finally, we've had a period of, in the logic of the past, of great power dominance. And in the logic of the future, we're going to need to have a much more equitable distribution of power, because the non-great powers have important claims that they are now asserting, because they are not able to manage entirely within their borders. They are dependent on the rest of the world, and they are asserting themselves because they are the victims of the great power decisions that cause the conflict, that extract resources, that continue to depend on an economy that is driven by fossil fuels. and that is producing greater and greater economic inequality. So those are a few examples. But I think that the point that is so fascinating about Antarctica is that it was in 1959 an example of the best that this logic of the past produced. And now we know that it's inadequate to the challenges of the future, and it needs to become, in my view, kind of the leading edge of the logic of the future. In some ways, I would put it this way: Antarctica is where the future of global governance is arriving early.
Mm, mm. Um, Thank you. That's a wonderful summary. And just in the last minute or so of this introductory section, I just wanted to note that you've had an incredible philanthropic career. And as we know, over the next decade, roughly $35 trillion will transfer between generations just in the United States alone, much of it routed into philanthropy. How do you see philanthropy as advancing institutional and governance structures that you've talked about that will carry us forward together in the face of the modern geopolitical and ecological challenges that we're facing?
Well, I've been leading one of the, I think, um, important institutions of legacy philanthropy now for the past 25 years, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And I have learned a lot about the strengths and the weaknesses of philanthropy during those 25 years. And I would say that during that period, we have seen rapid growth in philanthropy. We've seen a lot of new wealth come online even in that period. And so you had, for example, the addition of the Gates Foundation, which is a globally very significant and very large foundation, but many, many others. And the growth of philanthropy kind of worldwide has been very, very impressive. I think philanthropy has become has become more strategic. I think that it is having greater impact. But there is an important paradox in this. Philanthropy is having greater impact, and yet the challenges that many philanthropies are seeking to address are outpacing the impact that philanthropy is having. So, on a net basis, philanthropy is losing ground. And so this is where we are today. And then, as you said, Linda, we have the prospect of this infusion of very significant levels of new philanthropic capital, which is good news, except that there is a very serious risk that this new philanthropic capital will end up in institutional frameworks or vehicles that are not very transparent, not very well governed, um, egocentric, and given to short-term thinking. And as a result, all of this vast new philanthropic capital, trillions of dollars, may not have the impact that we need it to have in this age of turbulence and this age of crisis. So one of the things I've been thinking about as my tenure at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund comes to a close later this year is how can the legacy philanthropic institutions help shape the way that this influx of philanthropic capital is deployed? Can we work with the new wealth owners as they develop their approach to philanthropy so that we learn from them, because many of them have made their wealth through remarkable and ingenious innovation. But they also learn from us that there are certain things about transparency, about good governance, about expertise, and about the long view that are really essential if we are going to make the best use of philanthropy. Philanthropy has to both maintain an experimental disposition. We have to be willing to try things, to take risk, to fail, to admit failure, to learn from it, and try something else. And we also, at the same time, have to stick with things over a long period of time because we know the kind of profound change that we're talking about with regard to the governance of the global commons with Antarctica as Exhibit A takes time. And so creating that balance, I think, is one of the things that the legacy foundations might be able to bring to the conversation with the new philanthropic wealth.
Thank you. And thank you all for these initial thoughts, which set a stage for a little bit of conversation and discussion among the three of you. And we've been getting some questions in the chat, which are very helpful. I see one that is particularly amenable to integrating into one of these questions that's coming up. So I'll make sure that we get to those as many as we can. So please continue to put questions into the chat for this conversation, which, as we've heard, is an existential issue that we all need to be engaged in. So I'd like to kick off a conversation among the three of you. If Antarctica affects everyone, what do we mean? Can we say a little bit more about creating the conditions for preemptive peace in practice? What kind of steps might we take from either institutional, governance, technological, ecological, or organizing perspectives to create these conditions for preemptive peace in the context of Antarctica, as we've been discussing? And whoever would like to start, please feel free to jump in.
I'll jump in, Linda, and I'd just like to firstly reiterate what Stephen has said. I quite often reflect on Antarctica and consider it our nearest planet. It is that different when you see it up close, that it is quite jarring, just exactly how different it is. And then the governance of it follows suit. And one of the interesting things that I noted about Antarctica is that it reveals that broader planetary governance problem that you've highlighted, which is that our political systems are national, but now the systems that are destabilizing are planetary and cross-border and transboundary. So I think, Linda, to your question, what we do is we struggle to create legitimacy and voices for places and systems that affect everyone, but belong fully to no one. And we're now seeing that in these transboundary systems where there's cascading ecological risk, weak or fragmented political representation, or the political eyes are averted. There are no votes in Antarctica for any of the 12 signatory nations, or the 29 consultative nations, or the 59 observing nations. So these delayed consequences, extraction pressures in the first and civilized world outside of the polar regions are bringing strategic competition, and there's no real voice for Antarctica, and that is the major shift that has occurred since 1959, and now brings Antarctica into focus because it is affecting our daily lives.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that, either Stephen or Indy?
Well, I would just add, Linda, you used the phrase moments ago, political imagination. And I think that's what Antarctica is demanding of us, is new political imagination coupled, and this is the important counterpart, with political will. We have to both design the governance models of the future, and then we have to muster the political will to actually put them in place. And that will only happen, in my view, with the development of movements in the world that are about the planetary commons, movements for the planetary commons, as Andrew was saying. Who speaks for Antarctica? And we have to create the movements that speak for Antarctica. And the change will come as much from below, maybe even more so than it will from above. And so it's going to be this dialectic between, the political structures and political leadership at the top and global movements that are unrelenting in advocating on behalf of the global commons, that are going to force the new political imagination and create the political will to actually put in place the governance models of the future. It is not going to be easy, but it is essential.
Indy, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I think the reality is we're not trying to give the Antarctic a voice. We're trying to understand existential risk to ourselves. And I think the failure is actually that we're misunderstanding this as an existential risk to ourselves, not some kind of benevolence to the Antarctic. And I think the comprehension, the shared comprehension of that risk is being underpriced, and the effects of that risk is undervalued as well. So I think one of the big challenges the Arctic is throwing up to us, and I think it's not the only one, is that it is exhibiting the territorial divisional idea of governance no longer fit for purpose in a planet which is systemically entangled. And this recoupling of the planet, which is, I think, what we're operating into with the Westphalian state as a theory of organizing, no longer fits for a planet which is fundamentally coupled, and we are being forcibly coupled by climate breakdowns and other issues. So I think we're at the crisis of governance at the center of that. And I think, and this is where I think Stephen and Andrew, what they're saying is actually spot on, which is that in the 18th century, for example, in the middle of the 18th century, when the UK was in the middle of slavery, we do know there were solidarity movements between dockers in Liverpool and Jamaica and other sites on the other side. So that was in the 18th century. There were planetary sort of solidarity movements starting to think about that. Now, I would argue this is exactly the sort of politics we need to create around a planetary fishing community, which understands how vulnerable, basically, all our protein infrastructure is, or sea level communities. I think we're going to have to create hard constructions of power in civil society. And I think one of the big challenges I want to put into play is that civil society has become an edge of market and edge of state theory, as opposed to being foundational power. And how we build new radical power, hard power, contestable power, in a planetary sense on civil society will be a key part of moving and manifesting this reality. So we need civil litigation funds around the world working in cohorts to be able to effectively drive these rights as existential rights from communities around the world to preserve their reality, to build new forms of systematic solidarity. And this also and that's just one example. I think this is why I think we need a new theory of governance, which is about the Antarctic fundamentally being a planetary entangled good rather than divisional good. Then we need to be able to create the contestable power for civil society around that. And that then throws me to the final point that I think that Stephen, you were beautifully articulating, is the role of philanthropy. I think philanthropy is certainly outside the exception of the few brilliant landscapes that Stephen pointed to, has become what I'd call an edge of market tinkerer, sort of offering minor tinkerings because it says, oh, it's for the love of humanity. And actually, it is not a serious player. I'm going to evoke our friend from Succession, who said, we are not serious people. And I think there's a question about, are we serious to the level of the risk that we're facing? And I think what Stephen beautifully articulated is that every philanthropy has a mission. And if you looked at that kind of the fiduciary duty to achieve the mission relative to the endowment growth, what you'll find is the mission is running away from us, and the endowment is no longer going to is losing value relative to the mission. So even though it's getting 7% value, 10% value, relative to the mission loss, it's basically depreciating in value, which I think is a fiduciary problem and a responsibility problem of actually fulfilling the goals. So I think there's a really critical role of philanthropy no longer being just nice and to the edges of the story, but recognizing it as an existential actor in this problem space and starting to build the new third track. I mean, it's about 2.5, but new planetary organizing capacity that is able to build us the transition pathways. And it's not saying the states, I think states are locked into an existential fight or survival, and they need civil society to build the second order, so this track of organizing to shift the Overton window for states. And I think what we can do is shift the Overton window for states to recognize this entanglement. Everyone knows the UK is entangled with the Amazon. Everyone knows this is not a scientific problem. It's we don't have the political Overton windows for those realities to be manifest. And building that, I think, is a key responsibility to part of this. And I think that's a massive strategic opportunity. So just to pull that stuff together. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a wonderful conversation, and I've got a few follow. Oh, Andrew, sorry, you had your hand up. I just noticed that. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Very quickly, I'll concur both with Indy and Stephen and go a little bit further, which I do believe, I agree, Indy, with what you've said, and Stephen, about philanthropy and where it is now. And if we're looking at the systems and the transboundary cascading risks that we've got, then my view is that whether it's governance or philanthropy, whatever has worked in the past is not going to work in the future. We should be very, very wary of past solutions for these particular problems, because we have just established that we are facing things that we've never faced before. If that is correct, then I do believe that philanthropy, as well as other parts of civil society, needs to get into a mindset of crash or crash through. There is no point having an endowment in 100 years if we don't have ice sheets, right? There's just no point. So if there is something that can be brought to bear by philanthropy, by the transgenerational movement of this money, and done in the next 10 years, we should do it. And then, Indy, to your point about legitimacy and widening constituencies, and also you, Stephen, I think that the wicked problem here is that the people who are going to be affected don't know that they're going to be affected.
Mm.
So we are in a situation where, as we were saying before the call, the number of people that are actually, if you like, experts or conversant on Antarctica, the pressures, the governance, the science, are vanishingly small. But the risks that are apparent and coming down the pipe for everybody, and it's insurers, it's coastal communities, it's fishery, it's food systems, it's your mortgage. No one knows about this. And so where we have a problem in pricing risk from a purely economic point of view, Indy, is that either side of the deal actually do not know what's coming in very, very clear terms. And so, again, that creation of legitimacy outside the treaty room, and I'm not advocating for the disbanding of the Antarctic Treaty System, I am advocating for a much wider constituency that can be as vocal about Antarctica as they might be about their personal income taxes, because I actually believe that that's where we're going.
Indy, did you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, could I play into that? I mean, I really agree, Andrew, with what you're saying. And I think this is why, demand construction and investing in the construction of demand for transition is actually a critical part of that thesis. So building the awareness of that system level risk is a key asset and a key informational arbitrage that we should be going for and allocating to it. Then building on top of that, building the power to start to actually, like I said, the civic hard power to hold things to account. It won't work, but actually the coordinated power will create friction and the political demand. And then I think you're right, Andrew, that the institutions that we're likely to see, and my best bet is a few middle nations will first come together to actually build a kind of almost like a underwriters development bank and say, right, let's do something. It won't be done through the UN. It will be done as a voluntary action of a critical nations that are susceptible to key risks. So if you look at AMOC collapse, you would say, all nation states like Netherlands, UK, Norway, India as a result of monsoon collapse, they're susceptible to those risks. And to be able to manage those risks requires them to be able to build new types of institutions. They'll use that as an economic development engine to be able to build some of these futures in different ways. So I think this new politics, which will construct new institutional infrastructure. And like I say, the RIF for me is like the International Space Station program. It's almost looking at it this way with regards to management. But I think that's a full stack. We're going to have to construct the, as you say, build the consciousness of risk, build the hard power to be able to create a new form of planetary alliance in terms of civic hard power, to shift over to Windows, to allow governments to then be able to pool together in different ways. And I think it's now visible, there's new theories of power. And I think we're going to have to construct them actively in that framework. And I think that's and this is where I go from despair to excitement. I think that's really exciting. That is a planetary scale exciting thing that is necessary, plausible, and oh my God, necessity is a mother of really interesting invention there.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I see that folks are putting questions in the chat, which is wonderful. And I'd like to do a couple of quick follow-up questions to the panelists and integrate some of those chat questions in there, as well as make sure we have time, plenty of time soon to get to them individually if we haven't reached those yet. Just in terms of sort of political and moral imagination in the context of the existential risk and balancing that out and making sure we attend to that, I'd like to follow up with Stephen. Your Logic for the Future report recommends codifying the rights of nature. As you know, there's an active movement right now for recognition of the inherent rights of Antarctica. How do you see a movement for Antarctica's rights as helping develop these building blocks for a new leading edge governance system that may help safeguard ecological and larger well-being and peace?
Well, I'm very excited about this effort because I think it's exactly an example of the kind of political imagination and hard power that is necessary. On the one hand, the whole framework of the rights of nature 10 years ago was seen as a kind of a fringe concept. It's now much more into the mainstream, and we have seen actual jurisprudence around the rights of nature that has actually changed policy or corporate behavior. And that to me is very, very exciting because it's the innovative political imagination of a concept married to the hard power of going to the courts and getting judgment, producing result. And so it's a prime example of I think what we have to be doing in the future. And so applying this to thinking about the rights of Antarctica is, I think, completely appropriate and potentially one of the things that can accomplish the reaction to the shared existential implications of Antarctica. Because as everybody has said, what happens in Antarctica doesn't stay in Antarctica. It shows up on our shores. It shows up in our insurance costs. It shows up in our economies. And we need to get that message across. And one way to do that is to develop this jurisprudence around the rights of Antarctica and begin to use the hard power of the law and the courts to enforce it.
Thank you. And then just continuing, thank you very much for that. As a philanthropy that does support rights of nature and rights of Antarctica as well, I couldn't agree with you more. And then talking about just creating models, Andrew, you said that Antarctica can become a model that we can cross-fertilize to other multi-party spaces like the Amazon, the Arctic, the Himalayas. How do you see preemptive peace work in Antarctica creating lessons for these other spaces? And I also have a related question from the chat, which I'll share with you that gets to your expertise as well after this particular question.
Thank you. So, as we've established, Antarctica is unique because it can serve as a laboratory of governance study. It has worked for this long, and so we should be studying what are the elements that have allowed it to be so enduring. How do we fortify it so that it continues on? And then how do we propose the successful elements to these other commons. So whether it's Antarctica or the Arctic, the polar regions, but also the Amazon, Himalayas, the cryosphere, atmosphere, the ocean, and even there's sense in considering it for commons like our attention and what is occurring in the AI space. So where the commonalities with each of these are the transboundary risks and cascading risk, weak or fragmented political representation, which is clearly apparent in many domains now, and both geographically, but also temporally. And then these delayed consequences of that weak representation. So using it as a test case, because no state formally owns it, the governance infrastructure is already in place and there hasn't been an armed conflict, means that we could cross-fertilize that as a transferable governance framework where we build coalitions before crisis. We widen that legitimacy beyond the formal state parties. And that's pretty clear that in 2026, we do need to do that. Make invisible systemic risk politically visible to both sides of the market in that risk. Include ecological interests before collapse. So take away that anthropomorphism that Stephen was talking about, and create public constituencies for places most people never visit. So that's one of the things about Antarctica, which is most people can't go there. It's very expensive to go there. And, you know, some of the scientists do say, don't worry about going to Antarctica. If we keep it up, it'll come to you. So creating those constituencies is very important. Using the middle powers and subnational actors, we're now in a phase of the human trajectory where there are some companies that are bigger and have more influence than countries. So we need to engage right across the political spectrum, or rather the political width, and build restraint around the resources. So try and bind agreement and restraint wherever we can. And so that's how we could build an architecture of cross-fertilization. We just need to be understand that what matters in Antarctica and these other domains, both real and exemplary, that destabilization affects everybody. And Antarctica shows us the kind of governance problem that the 21st century is going to face again and again and again through these shared systems. So they have delayed consequences, fragmented authority. So we need to act before breakdown. And that's why this conversation is so rare, but really so important to be having.
And I see, Indy, I believe you wanted to comment on this. Your hand's up.
Yeah, no, I suppose I think the rights of nature movement has been really important. And to be provocative, it may not be sufficient. Because I think it presumes a divisibility between human and nature needs or separation, which I think one of the big challenges that we face is that there was no pathway to, like, even if we were to leave the Arctic alone, it works. I think we're so high in interdependency now that we are going to have to regenerate these contexts. That I think there's a really interesting question of whether separability, divisibility, rights to a system, or are we looking at a fundamentally different thesis, which is about recognizing our entanglements and taking a systems view of interdependency? Is there a different pathway available? And I think, you know, even say, for example, the rights of river work that happened in New Zealand, what was kind of often underdocumented from a Western thesis was that actually the river was deemed the grandmother, and it was a relationship of rooting of new forms of relationship. It wasn't the right of the river as a non-related species. It was a relationship coded in a different form of care, bilateral care. And I think there's something about how we manifest this. I suppose I'm just asking the question, in a world where conservation is not sufficient and the entanglement is fundamental, is a divisional theory of rights of location and geography intrinsic? Is that going to be viable, or are we fundamentally looking at a terra preta future? And like, for example, the Amazon, if we assume a terra preta future, you would say it's a multi-species open garden that was really being curated there, which is a human ecological, technological partnership as opposed to divisibility and assignment rights in single theory. And I have a philosophical question whether it's going to get us there. And the worry I have, just so it's super clear, is that I think conservation can very clearly become a tool, an anti-human tool. So where we preserve the ecology at in conflict with human needs. And I think if we set up that language and that frame, which I think a lot of the ecological conservation movement has also becoming increasingly adopted by right and far right frameworks, I think we'll set up another pathway of destruction. So I just want to put a little bit of spice into this conversation to be able to recognize that we're now having to intersect across, and I think the divisibility of nature versus human, I think is a false divisibility. And I think we need to right now re-entangle human nature ecological systems into a single point of view rather than a divisible point of view. And I know this is in sophistication often carried out in the nature rights movement, but I want to, maybe there's an ontological crisis at the center of this, which needs to be more deeply questioned and opened up into that framework. So, my gut feeling is that we're going to have to take these views as a system view rather than a separationist view.
Thank you, Indy, and thank you for that. And Stephen, did you want to respond to either Andrew and or Indy before we jump to more questions from the chat?
Yes, thank you. And I'll try to be brief. I was provoked by Indy because in part I agree with you, Indy, and in part I don't. The part that I agree with is that I certainly don't think that even the fullest embrace and application of the rights of nature is not going to be sufficient. That's for sure. I, on the other hand, don't think it's another act of division. I think it's an act of inclusion and bringing together of nature and human beings into the same space, into the same framework of rights. And so I think it's an act of political imagination that is a partial solution to the larger systemic problems that I think we all are addressing and that we're all deeply worried about. And the only other thing I would say about it, and Linda, this really reflects a lot of the work that you've been doing for many, many years. This is an example of where philanthropy has made a real difference. Because I would argue that without philanthropy, the whole rights of nature concept would not be as powerful as it's become today. Insufficient as it may be, essential as it also is.
Stephen, can I play with that a little bit? Could I just do a follow-on play with that? Would that be all right, Linda?
Sure. Yes, as long as yeah, absolutely, for
Sure.
another minute, and then yeah.
I think the question I'm holding is what is good for the Arctic or the Antarctic? And who defines that good? And is it the preservation of the present? Is it the explosion of life on the Antarctica, which we could unleash if we release the water levels up in the Antarctica? So the kind of thesis of good, I think, is where I think the crisis starts to emerge in terms of what is the theory of good. And whereas if you see the theory of good as being a relational problem, I think it becomes an emergent thing as opposed to a predefined thing. So I would assume the rights of nature sit in a theory of good, i.e., what is good? What is the good life for the Antarctic or humans? And I think that's what I'm saying is I think there's an interesting question. And Linda, I know you're a massive expert in this as well, but I'd love for you to come in as well, and also Andrew, just because I do think that it's a really good innovation. And the question is it sufficient? And will it survive this existential crisis, the existential crisis of states that we're sitting in?
If I could just jump in for just a minute. I agree with all of what is being said, that that relationality, recognizing that we're entangled, recognizing that we have a duty to care, that reciprocal duty to care is absolutely essential. And the rights of nature are an incredibly important innovation and legal tool and also a tool to be able to help us understand and shift our minds away from the old logic, as Stephen was talking about earlier, this logic of maximizing, short-term wealth and efficiency with nature as an object, to this next step, thinking about shared thriving, where thriving includes all the systems on Earth, and all the peoples and the middle powers, which was another thing that you've spoken eloquently about, Indy, and how we engage people more broadly. The Antarctic Treaty System was fairly exclusionary in terms of which powers they included, and this logic for the future needs to be broad. Rights are the system that we have now. Human rights are the system we have now. Corporate rights are the system we have now. Talking about rights of nature allows us to expand how we think so that we get to that next step where we're all relational. So I think that this is a conversation that we all, I think, are agreeing on, and in this idea of the divisibility, the pushing nature aside and sort of preserving and conserving and kind of keeping it, separate from us, is a false dichotomy, because we are all interconnected, and what Antarctica does and what we do affects each other and Antarctica integrally. And so how do we use, as Stephen was talking about, this logic for the future? How does Antarctica sit at the leading edge of how we develop logic for the future in terms of this relationality, this shared sovereignty, Antarctica as sovereign? What does that look like? It opens up conversations that we've yet to have, that we're just starting to have. And I look forward to those conversations. I think they're going to be robust and interesting, and it's going to have to include all of us. And some of the questions in the chat get to those partners that we might be able to engage and have a conversation with, that we haven't been doing before. Philanthropy is one of them, but there are many others. So it's just some initial thoughts that I have, and I think Andrew has his hand raised as well. And then I do want to make sure there's some amazing questions in the chat that I want to make sure I get to as well.
Yeah, very very quick comment, just for Indy and Stephen, to reiterate and affirm both of you. The amazing thing about philanthropy is truly social venture capital. It takes the risks and the bets in areas that we have not decided. Engineering's decided, accounting is decided, homelessness is not yet decided, and so that's why philanthropy gets in and tries to find solutions to problems like homelessness and nutrition in sub-Saharan Africa and diseases. So it is true venture capital, and I would just like to affirm you both that we're actually not standing still. Philanthropy has done what it needed to do to give rights of nature that leg up to protect a river or a space and become sort of that laboratory of rights of nature. But I think that you're right, Linda. Rights of nature should then just be every river, every ocean, the cryosphere, and so I think that's the challenge for philanthropy is to move to that level of aspiration and of ambition, but it's also the purview of, or the preserve of rights of nature, to extend that just away from one river in, say, New Zealand, to how do we treat all rivers? How do we treat that interconnectedness of nature? And so therefore we are on a moving trajectory, and I think that that's the ambition that both philanthropy and rights of nature should and can and do have.
Yes, as I said at the beginning, this is an incredibly interesting conversation, especially about an amazing space like Antarctica that we're all just really learning about and engaging with. I'd like to follow up with a couple of questions from the chat that I think get to an additional question I was going to share with Indy, thinking about organizing and power and risk. And I think there have been a couple of questions in the chat with regard to philanthropy and their role in these issues as well. And Indy, you've talked about the importance of middle powers, and there's only 29 consultative parties to the ATS. Most of the middle powers are excluded from meaningful Antarctic decision making. And then, as we've heard, as Andrew said earlier, many of these powers can also not effectively internalize the expected systemic risk from Antarctic degradation. We just don't know. What kind of potential do you see for power and organizing at the national or subnational level based on this type of risk? And how do we see that playing out in practice? And just to throw out a couple of related questions from the chat, For Indy or Stephen, and also Andrew, how do we start to shift power towards more of a network approach? If we're talking about organizing and power and risk and people being excluded in the past, but this logic in the future, how do we network them in? And one of the specific questions was with regard to the business community, corporations, who do hold rights, but how can corporations be part of the solution in a way that philanthropy has been part of the solution as opposed to part of the challenge? How can we engage in a much broader way? So maybe I'll just throw that out to Indy to start in terms of these questions about organizing power and risk, and then maybe open it up a little bit.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I think it really goes back to what Andrew said right at the beginning, which is that I think people do not have an awareness of these risks. And I think that lack of awareness is being arbitraged by certain sections of global power. I think one, building that awareness. Second, I have to be honest, as soon as the Antarctica can be perceived as an existential risk, the treaty becomes immaterial. The treaty is just kindness till states start to perceive it, and the loss of the Antarctica as a material existential risk to nation states. As soon as that happens, I think we're in a completely different diplomacy space. And I think recognizing that that's probably the reality that we're moving towards, unfortunately or fortunately, I think is interesting. I think and the question that it opens up, and I think Andrew, you shared earlier previous conversations like how Saudi Arabia had moved to becoming a signatory. I think we're starting to see states start to recognize the kind of location of the Antarctica as a strategic risk. We can see that say, for example, from what I understand, how China is perceiving protein and nutrition risk over the next 10, 15 years. I think there's going to be some very interesting and important openings with regards to what the governance of the Antarctic looks like. And I think the question is, how do you create, and this is where I think, I think states are going to be not necessarily the most helpful in terms of the diplomacy landscape, but I think if we can get to a layer below states where risk and everyday experiences, whether it's mortgages, whether it's fish stocks, all the way through, if we can get to building the politics at that level, then we will create the landscape for states. And I think we're going to have to operate at the planetary civic level to be able to construct this politics. And I think that is a different theory of intervention rather than actually just how do we convene some representative stakeholders right now. I don't think they have the politics to be able to, the open windows to be able to negotiate. And that's why I would say, I think the work right now is creating those planetary civics, creating those movements, creating those hard power influences around them, creating the litigation capacity, building that accountability engine at the ground level, building the civic awareness. That's where the work is right now. And the Overton windows will open up in different ways around that. And I think it will be a few nation states that will, unusual national states will open up those landscapes in different formats, alliances will form, and I think new forms of treaty and agreement will come. So I would say that's how I'm currently perceiving that pathway right now in terms of being able to respond to it.
Stephen or Andrew, did you have any follow-up to that? Any additional things you'd like to add?
Well, I would just add one other element. I absolutely agree that we need to move to a kind of planetary civics, as it were, and planetary civil society, which of course depends on planetary consciousness in philanthropy. And I think there is progress in that regard, but clearly not enough progress. But another domain that I think is very important is in the academy. I think we need to be training people differently for the future. And as a result of the work I did on a logic for the future, I'm part of a team of people that is trying to build a new curriculum for international relations that really focuses on people, state, and planet. And we have been adding the notion of the machine because we now see every day that the power of the machine is growing, so quickly that it's hard to even understand. But the training of people who are going to be engaged in these issues and working to build planetary civil society working to build planetary level institutions in response to these existential crises is got to be an important element of this, including the training of diplomats. That's another area that I'm interested in, is how we train diplomats not only to be good representatives of their nation's national interests, how we train them to be good representatives and negotiate effectively on behalf of the global commons.
Mhm. Yes, and there's a growing attention to that last point that you raised, Stephen, nature-focused diplomacy. How do we incorporate nature and natural systems and ecology into the larger question? And getting back to Indy's point about entanglement.
Precisely,
Indy,
precisely.
yeah. Indy, you
No,
wanted to follow up on that?
yeah, there's two things, and I think Stephen just highlighted them. One was, I think there were increasingly we're seeing lots of capital pools around oceans. And I think if they fully understood the Antarctic risk, I think we'll see some of that. So I think intergenerational wealth and intergenerational stewardship of wealth, which can be funds, I think is increasingly a really key actor in terms of managing these risks and getting them to be aware with regards to the existential risk to capital itself as a result of the optionality loss. And the second thing I just wanted to say was that I think that it is highlighting our failure to govern these sorts of environments is highlighting a systemic failure in democracies, which is like one of the things we've been advocating for is a 100-year parliament. So the House of Lords in the UK moving to a 100-year house. And why that's important is that when you move to a horizon of 100 year, these risks become manifest and real to the governance of the UK. They become non-ignorable, as opposed to the House of Commons, which can parley them to the next parliament, and set them off. So there is something interesting about offsetting how we govern this might also be real systemic challenges for the long-term governance that democracies are failing to be able to govern for, and the invitation for building that capacity in novel capacity. So those might be other two levers that are available along with planetary civics.
And Andrew, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, I agree with you, Indy, on long-term parliaments. I do believe that countries should shift to putting in place mandates and agendas for long-term health, education, environmental priorities that are not being shifted every time there's an election. So that's a terrific idea. Just on your point about the treaty, I think that um, as big a fan I am and a critic at exactly the same time, I have a difficult relationship with it. But I do believe that the treaty must remain a floor, but it cannot be the ceiling, and that's what it is at the moment. But it must be the platform on which we build the next level of constituency, because as these risks become visible to those actors and constituencies that cannot see the risks, so states, cities, insurers, coastal communities, ports, security communities, the politics of the treaty will change. So unfortunately, institutions rarely have a mirror that they look at themselves in and test, whether they fit the particular clothes that they're wearing. And I think it's these conversations that focus, in this case, on the Antarctic Treaty System, but there are other domains, as we've mentioned, really do hold a mirror up to these institutions and say, it's time to change, it's time to evolve. As Stephen has said, it's come from a different era, but we now need to move from whether it's consensus as protocol into another way. There's tremendous pressure around the Antarctic Treaty System at the moment because there's no media access to the meetings of either the ATS or CAMLR, which governs the ocean around Antarctica. The communiques and reports come out quite some time after the meeting. And so all of these constituencies are in the dark as to what happened at the annual meeting, and they're not seeing the risk as we've discussed. So I think that that's a really important point, that we use that platform that is there, because I don't think that demolishing it and building something in its place will give us sufficient cycle time to get to where we want to be.
We're just about to close, and fortunately, as you've been talking, we've been addressing some of these questions in the chat. especially around your last point, Andrew, with regard to the limitations of consensus-based decision making. One last question, and then maybe just a quick 1 minute each on in terms of last words, is for Stephen and whoever wants to comment in. Is there an appetite among philanthropy to fund collective action initiatives that and bringing in the types of actors that perhaps we might not have seen yet? Do you have any thoughts about pulling together folks to make this a more democratic process and pull in perceptions of strategy and risk and systems among a broader constituency?
I do think there's some appetite for this. But I think one of the themes of this conversation in its focus on philanthropy has been whether philanthropy is really living up to its risk responsibility. I would put it this way, that because we are quite independent, because we operate with very little oversight or regulatory frameworks, because we have capital, we have the ability to take risks that government won't take because of political constraints and the private sector won't take because of profit motivation. And so if we're not utilizing risk effectively, if we're not considering risk our greatest asset in some ways, then we are not performing what we need to perform. So to the particular of this question, I'm not sure enough philanthropy is willing to take the risk of supporting those kinds of movements and activities. And the fact that they see it as a risk is even tells us something. So part of what I think needs to happen is the education of philanthropies and the pressure on philanthropies to do more with the risk assets that they have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I agree. So we're closing in at the end of this discussion, and if we could just take 1 minute from each of you in the order we originally saw you, maybe start with Andrew. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Stephen, Indy, Linda. Thank you so much for surfacing such a rich discussion. I agree, Stephen. Philanthropy is the first risk capital. It's the seed risk that can really turn and bring about change. I do believe that the legitimacy and wider constituency of this conversation out um, into everyday conversations about Antarctica is very important. That's the challenge that we have, and ultimately it's a sense making project. The Antarctic system has institutions and universities and governance bodies and research, but it doesn't have a mirror that is held up to it, and there's significant sense making that is required to enunciate this risk to those people who are at risk, and then to also explain that risk to those people in philanthropy, in power, particularly in the middle powers, that can actually affect change. The one point that I would make is that there's 12 signatory nations to the treaty, and then there's the consultative nations. Any one nation that stands up at one of those meetings essentially is taking on the playground bully in the big powers that are gamifying the ATS at the moment. The middle powers can do a tremendous job, because if 8 of them get together, then it's 8 against 1 or 2 or 3. And that is actually the power dynamic that is missing in the ATS at the moment. And it's really important for conversations like this, for philanthropy to raise that conversation to a level where our political representatives feel confident in actually building those coalitions.
Thank you. Indy, do you have any final thoughts as well?
Yeah, I mean, just building on what Andrew said, I think this is a kind of 21st century political engineering problem, and it won't be solved by our nation states, unfortunately, at this stage. I think we're going to have to build the groundswell in a different way, which is going to be these sorts of planetary civic movements, recognizing risk to agents around the world and building hard planetary power. And this, I think, not only has benefits for the Antarctic, it has benefits around the world for multiple critical issues. So building this ground infrastructure, I think, is really key. And I think in response to that, I think this requires capital stewards to recognize the existential risk to capital in the failure of achieving these movements. And so this, I think, it reframes both philanthropy, but also capital stewardship more broadly, which needs to be allocated sufficient resource to the management of risk that to its own viable optional space of allocation. So I think there's a bigger question. Do we need to build a new movement of capital holders, which are both private capital holders allocating as a risk management framework, but also philanthropy coming together on these types of capabilities and building that institutional infrastructure at the planetary scale? And I think this planetary movement landscape is really key. So I really thank you for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And Stephen, the last word.
I see we're really out of time, so I'll be very quick. First, I just want to say I'm really grateful to have been invited into this conversation because it's challenged me to think a lot more about um, the Antarctic as it challenges us to think about the future of global governance, and that has been enormously valuable. And I also want to say the problem seems so big and so daunting, and at times, Indy, you used the word earlier, it's easy to give in to despair, which we cannot do because despair will only exacerbate the problem. And I want to leave everybody with one thought, and it's a quote from Hannah Arendt, who said, "We are free to change the world and start something new in it." And that, in fact, is exactly what we have to do.
Thank you. I can't imagine a better place to close. And thank you so much to all of the panelists for your time and to the staff for your assistance, and of course the audience for your attention and amazing questions. Thank you very much. And the conversation continues, but this concludes this webinar for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda, also.
Thank you. Terrific.
Thanks, everybody. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks, that's great.
Take care.
See you, mate.
Cheers, mate. Are we going to catch up? Is there a time in the diary booked in between everyone?
I think